The boatswain of the SS Austria dipped the hot metal chain into a bucket of tar that had been set aside for the purpose of fumigating the steerage class of the ship. As often happened on immigrant ships of the mid-1800s, the 2,684-ton ship had 450 people in steerage alone. Fumigation was often needed. As he dipped his chain into the bucket, though, disaster was only minutes away.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the rapid fire of the SS Austria?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The SS Austria, an iron-hulled four-screw steamer, was a new ship only a year old in 1858. This voyage was only her third on this route, traveling for the Hamburg line from Hamburg to New York. She had been built by the Caird & Co. shipyard of Greenock, Scotland, and had originally been intended for the British government. But when that charter was cancelled, the Hamburg line was quick to step in. With 3 masts and a single screw propeller, the Austria was considered a fast ship and was described as one of the best ships in her class. On the 2nd of September, 1858, the Austria departed Hamburg and made a short stop in Southampton to take on additional passengers on the 4th. Unfortunately, a fog delayed their departure, and the ship was forced to anchor near the Isle of Wight. It was when weighing the anchor next morning to continue the Atlantic crossing that the first sign of trouble for the ship occurred. Charles Bruce, one of the passengers who had gotten on board at Southampton, would later tell the story, but he could not explain exactly what had occurred, other than that there had been some sort of mismanagement with the anchor. As a result, the capstan suddenly started to spin with a terrifying force, flinging the men in all directions and injuring some of them. One of the men was thrown completely overboard, and when he did not rise again, it was presumed that the force of the blow of the capstan had been too much for him. It was not an auspicious beginning, but the voyage was about to get worse. For days, the Austria was faced with strong winds opposed to their course. They were going at a much slower rate of speed than they were scheduled for, and it was becoming clear that they were going to end up arriving in New York later than planned. It was not until the 12th of September that the wind came around in their favor, and by the morning of the 13th, they were traveling close to the ship's top speed of 11 knots. The optimistic passengers and crew hoped that with the change in the weather, they would be in New York by the 18th. With the voyage having been prolonged, it was also decided on the 13th by the captain and the ship's surgeon that it would be best if the ship's steerage was fumigated with burning tar. That there was a need to fumigate at all was a matter of some discussion later, but the third-class passengers were all ordered to the deck so that it could be done. They joined many of the other passengers who were enjoying the pleasant weather on the deck of the ship, playing games and enjoying the sea air. Up until this point, most of them had been trapped below in their berths of cabins by the poor weather. The boatswain had only just begun the process of fumigation, dipping a red-hot chain into a bucket of tar, when he discovered that the heat had traveled too far up the chain. Unable to hold the chain any longer, it fell to the deck. Almost immediately, the deck started to burn, and the tar which he had been dripping the chain into tipped over, causing the fire to spread rapidly. There was nothing at hand that could be used to put out the fire, and around 2 in the afternoon, the first sign of choking smoke escaped from the entrance of steerage. Some women burst out onto the deck at the same time, making the announcement that the ship was on fire. Almost as soon as the news of the fire was announced, the engine was slowed to half speed, but that would be the last communication anyone had with the engine crew. It is supposed that they fell to the smoke and other fumes shortly after slowing the ship, and there was no longer a way to stop the ship as the fire raged on. The passenger, Charles Bruce, was on the quarterdeck of the ship when he saw the flames begin to break through amidship, and he realized that since the ship was traveling with her head to the wind, it was increasing the speed with which the fire was traveling. He tried to communicate this to the man at the wheel, but since the man at the wheel only spoke German, Bruce was forced to leave this communication to a German passenger who he found to translate. Nearby, he could see a boat attempting to be launched, but it was quickly destroyed by the ship's screw. Bruce went to try to launch the boat across the quarterdeck from the one that had been smashed, but found so many other people already swarming to it that he stepped away. After a few minutes, the crowd dispersed enough that he was able to aid in the launch of the boat, but on seeing a boat being launched, the crowd rushed to get on board of it, sinking it. Bruce and the other people who had launched the boat in the first place lowered ropes to try and pull the people who were now struggling in the water back up, but the only person they were able to save was the ship's steward. They were driven away from their rescue work by flames, which drove them back from where the boat had been launched. Theodor Glaubensky was in his stateroom when he heard the cry of fire. He rushed to the deck to see the flames already breaking through the deck amidship. He could see the Captain Heidemann of the ship fighting to reach one of the lifeboats through the crowd. When the cry of fire had broke out, rather than trying to coordinate an evacuation or trying to slow the spread, Captain Heidemann had rushed to the deck and shown as much panic as the majority of the passengers. Sven Petersen, an experienced sailor who was traveling in third class, described the captain as rushing onto the deck, clasping his hands and crying that they were all lost. Petersen pointed to two ships he could see in the distance to the captain, but Captain Heidemann did not seem to hear him. Petersen expected that he would order the launching of the boats, but instead, First Mate Hahn was the only officer who attempted to clear and organize a launch of the ship's boats. He too took the first chance he could find and boarded one of the boats he was launching, however, cutting it away himself and making his escape from the burning ship. It was later found that instead of attempting to launch the ship's boats, Captain Heidemann, along with the ship's fourth officer, had attempted to board a boat as it was being launched by swinging down on ropes. This was one of the lifeboats that was struck by the ship's still moving screws, and none of the people who had been on board of her were seen again. The idea of the lifeboats being a great help in such a situation was not likely. Though the Titanic still in the future, concerns were already being voiced about the inadequate number of lifeboats that passengers' ships generally carried. The Austria carried a total of 8 boats, 4 metal and 4 wooden. Of these boats, some were smashed in the propellers, and one of the wooden boats burned before it could be launched. The press of people trying to get onto the lifeboats made it impossible to launch them properly. The people on them instead simply cut the lines holding the boats, causing them to fall the 20 feet into the ocean. This was enough to sink most of the boats on impact, or caused them to capsize and throw the people who had managed to get into them into the ocean. There were also not many other life-saving items available to those who found themselves between the fire and the sea. With the fire burning from the middle of the ship, everyone was driven either to the stern or bow, and it was later said that the aft part of the ship only had 5 life preservers in total. Within 5 minutes of the fire being announced, communication between the forward and stern of the ship was completely cut off, causing families to be separated, and more chaos ensued as people searched for friends and loved ones. Most of the people in second class never stood a chance. They were trapped. And though a few were pulled through ventilation openings, the flames soon defeated all efforts. Until they were driven back by the flames, some of the passengers, who were determined to do their best to help those who were trapped, lowered buckets of water to the second deck, but the small buckets were of little use against the roaring fire and billowing smoke. A majority of the buckets that the passengers did attempt to grab were found to be chained to the deck, and therefore unusable. The ship's smoking room, a beautifully appointed space that had been one of their points of pride, became a trap that no one escaped from. Soon after the fire started to spread across the deck, the helmsman abandoned his post entirely, which allowed the ship to swing into the wind. This made the entire situation even more dangerous than it was before. First Engineer Van Morgenstern came onto the deck and called down to the engine room to stop the engine and start the steam pumps. On realizing that he was getting no response, he went down below himself. Sometime later, a passenger would see him on fire throwing himself into the sea. His name was not among those who were rescued. The ship would continue to travel at half speed until the ship's magazine exploded about a half hour after the fire was announced on deck. This finally put a stop to the ship's engines. The ship's masts had also begun to collapse at this point as the fire continued to rage. People were now leaping from the ship. In some cases, it was calculated, people simply decided that they preferred the idea of ending it in the sea rather than the fire. Others were driven off the ship by the strong heat and flames. In many cases, people's clothing was on fire as they jumped. The ships that Sven Petersen had pointed out to Captain Heidemann in the distance as a hope for them now got closer. One of them changed its course and headed towards the burning ship, already readying her 2 small boats to launch. The other ship, which was never named, continued on its original course without stopping, even though the captain that had changed his course signaled to them to help. The ship coming to the aid of the SS Austria was found to be a French barque, the Maurice, under the command of Captain Renaud. The first and second officer of the Maurice each took command of a boat and headed towards the burning ship. The boat that first mate Kuhn had launched from the Austria still had people on board of it, even though it was half full of water from its fall from the ship and seemed in danger of sinking at any time. Some of the people who had started out on board of the boat were now forced to cling to its sides, or be held afloat with oars by those who were in the boat, since them climbing into the boat would likely be the final straw to sinking it. After a few hours, they came to a man who was clinging to a buoy, and they offered him a place in the boat in exchange for the buoy. The first mate used a knife to cut the buoy in half. Most of the people left the boat, while the 2 men used the 2 pieces of buoy to bail the boat out. The only person not bailing who was allowed to remain in the boat was a young woman who was very injured and was in no position to go anywhere. With the boat bailed out, and everyone able to climb back in, it was now manageable for the first time, and using the oars, the first mate was able to bring them alongside the Maurice. On climbing on board the Maurice, each person pulled up onto the stable deck of the ship and hugged Captain Renaud, before the crew of the Maurice got to work trying to find them clothing and food. The injured woman was laid down in the ship's cabin, and her wounds were taken care of the best that they could. For hours, the Maurice's boats worked to pull people out of the water. Since people had jumped off of the ship or launched boats from her while she was still moving, and so found themselves left behind in the water by the burning ship. A few lucky people managed to cling to ropes and chains from over the side of the Austria without being driven off by fire and heat. They were among the first to be rescued as the Maurice's boats came near the Austria, and they were able to drop into the sea near them. Once they'd collected the people that they could see hanging from the ship, though, the boats from the Maurice got to work collecting the human wake of the Austria. It was hard and slow work, especially since the boats of the Maurice were small enough that they could not hold many people before they had to return to the Maurice to unload before returning to rescue more. Many of the people who were pulled out of the water described holding onto pieces of wreckage and pieces of shattered lifeboats for up to 6 hours before they were pulled from the sea. The rescue work was finally put to an end as night fell, and the men of the Maurice could no longer see the people in the water. The New York Tribune would later condemn this stoppage of rescue work, saying that it should have been possible for the Maurice to work by the light of the burning Austria, but since most of the people who were in the water were now a long distance from the Austria, it is believed that they were forced to stop working for the night. Captain Renaud chose not to rest, however. Through the night, he and Jean Polkruski, one of the passengers who had been saved from the Austria, attended the wounded that now filled the Maurice. The New York Tribune was also harsh in its comments on the actions of First Mate Kuhn, who had a perfectly fine lifeboat once it had been bailed out, and most of the people in his lifeboat were sailors from the Austria. The New York Tribune pointed out that it would have been fully possible for him to crew the boat and to join in the rescue work, something that does not seem to have occurred to First Mate Kuhn, who remained on board the Maurice after being rescued. As dawn broke, the Maurice circled the Austria again, which had not stopped burning through the night. As they patrolled, they found a third lifeboat that had been launched, which had fallen so far behind the Austria that they had failed to see it at all the day before. She had capsized when she had hit the water, but some of the people on her had managed to right her. The 23 people on board of her had spent 25 hours uncertain of rescue and stepped on board of the Maurice gratefully. The Norwegian ship Katatina also approached the burning Austria and was able to save a further 22 people. In total, between the Maurice and the Katatina, 89 people survived, out of the 597 people who had been on board of the Austria when she had left Southampton. True to her nature as an immigrant ship, entire families were lost, while people who had survived lost everything. The Austria was one of the greatest shipping disasters of its time, though mostly forgotten now. The passengers were quick to point to the officers as the culprits of the tragedy, and the papers were quick to follow. Almost everyone agreed that organized action could have prevented such a large-scale tragedy, if not stifled the fire before it got out of control entirely. Included in the survivors were the first, second, and third mates, as well as the boatswain's mate, the quartermaster, the steward, and one of the engineer's assistants. The officers who were not on board the Maurice had also been seen trying to escape the Austria, with the exception of Chief Engineer von Morgenstern, who had tried to stop the engines. The loss of the Austria would spark a lengthy discussion about negligence, the importance of ship discipline, safety standards on ships, and improvements that could be made in lifeboat designs. Many people had thought that the newly built metal ships were immune to the fires that had terrorized the shipping industry for centuries. The Austria would be a stark reminder that the valuable mahogany furnishings, fine carpets, and velvet curtains that were the mark of luxurious travel on passenger steamers were just as flammable as the wooden-hulled ships that the metal ships were replacing. A reform of safety standards would still be in the distant future, however.
For more information, please see the New York Herald from September 28, 1858, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.